Today, we're opening up a topic that might sound a bit academic at first glance. We're looking very specifically at museums in Morocco during the French Protectorate. And, well, as we'll unpack, it's really much more than just cultural history.
Oh, absolutely. The sources we've looked at, they basically lay out a kind of blueprint, don't they, for how colonial powers worked. It wasn't just about territory.
No, it seems they actively weaponize things that seem neutral. You know, archives, archaeology, and, museums, all to cement their control.
And to justify why they were even there in the first place.
Precisely. So our mission today really is to get past that surface-level idea of scientific work and understand how these places actually functioned in Morocco, say, between 1912 and 1956.
And that central question keeps coming up in the sources, doesn't it? Were these museums genuinely about preserving culture? Or were they, at their core, tools of colonialism, propaganda, maybe even economic strategy?
That's the core conflict we're diving into.
And maybe we should first set the scene geographically. It's important for you listening to know we're focusing exclusively on the French Protectorate zone.
Okay, why just the French zone?
Well, the Spanish zone, for example, it had very few museums, and the ones it did have came much later, often without much, systematic organization.
And Tangier, the international zone.
Different again. Tangier didn't really have formal, structured institutions for arts or heritage back then. It was more about sort of scattered research by amateurs, often under diplomatic protection, and often quite late in the period.
Got it. So we're really looking at the legacy left by the French administration, an inheritance of what, about 30 institutions across their zone?
Roughly that number, yes. Which leads us right into that fundamental tension, that core conflict we mentioned.
The idea that colonial powers adapted science for their own ends.
Exactly. Going back to the 19th century, they weren't naive. They figured out that by using the human sciences, archaeology, ethnography, history, they could build a really sophisticated justification for being there, for intervening militarily and politically.
And they framed it in different ways, I suppose.
Yeah, sometimes it was about spreading Western civilization. Other times, and this is quite ironic, it was about preserving the local heritage, which they claimed the local powers were letting decay.
Right. And in Morocco, how did that play out specifically?
It meant that French officials maintained an absolutely complete airtight monopoly over the whole museum discourse.
So they didn't just pick the objects, they controlled the whole story.
Everything. The interpretation, how things were classified, how they were presented, the entire framework was French.
Wow. And you mentioned this discourse was calculated.
Oh, absolutely. The sources make it clear it was formulated exclusively by French officials, administrators, military officers, intelligence agents sometimes, and it was designed purely to transmit their ideas about France's role.
Ideas stretching way back.
Yes, from supposed historical links to the Roman era, all the way up to France's self-proclaimed role in modernizing Moroccan institutions, even crafts. They basically owned the narrative, past, present, and the future they envisioned.
So not an organic development at all. It's a manufactured narrative.
Yeah.
Let's unpack that monopoly. Who are these museums actually for? I mean, who was the intended audience? The sources seem pretty clear. The main goal was showing off French power by controlling the story of the objects.
And crucially, the collections generally weren't really intended for Moroccans.
That seems like a huge contradiction right there.
It is. It's the core contradiction, really, of this whole colonial museum model in Morocco. And it's so different from what was happening in Europe around the same time.
How so?
Well, in Europe, you had the rise of what they called Musées des Arts et Traditions Populaires, ATP museums, basically museums of popular traditions.
Okay.
And those museums were being set up specifically to save evidence of crafts and regional cultures that were genuinely disappearing because of industrialization and people moving to cities.
So preserving things that were actually vanishing, a lost past.
Exactly. But in Morocco, especially in the museums of indigenous arts, a lot of the things they put on display, everyday textiles, certain pottery styles, farm tools, jewelry people wore daily, these were still very much part of people's living culture.
Right, people were still using these things.
Precisely. So the museum wasn't preserving something lost, it was taking a living, breathing culture and turning it into a kind of static display, mainly for foreigners to look at.
So the museum itself, as an institution, was fundamentally imposed even.
Completely imposed. It lacked any real local necessity or demand from the Moroccan population at the time. It was basically a projection of French power onto the local scene.
And they reinforced this through how they presented things.
Yes, through deliberate techniques of, well, cultural exclusion. Museum staff, the administrators, they consistently pushed codes of exoticism and also what we call folklorization. That's how they marked, labeled, and staged the items.
Can you explain that term a bit more? Folklorization, how does that exclude people?
Sure. To folklorize something is basically to strip it of its real significance, maybe its political weight, or its monumental status, or its national meaning. And instead, you just label it as quaint or traditional or local craft. So instead of seeing, say, a piece of silver jewelry as reflecting complex regional identity or trade networks or social status, it gets labeled as maybe naive or fanciful, just a rustic curiosity.
So they weren't cataloging things for genuine study, presenting them as part of an ongoing history. They were picking things to fit a pre-written, simplified story, a story for tourists or administrators.
Exactly. That's the key point. Collections were selected and displayed to show off Moroccan diversity, but, and this is crucial, Moroccans themselves had zero say in how things were chosen, classified, or interpreted. The whole presentation was designed to capture the imagination of visitors, tourists, officials, soldiers, while at the same time hammering home the supposed benefits of colonialism. You know, look how we're preserving and civilizing these exotic things. It was cultural exclusion, pure and simple, based entirely on colonial ideology.
The message being, look at this fascinating stuff that only we, the French, can truly understand and seize.
Pretty much. But there was one big exception to this ethnographic approach, and that was in the antiquities museums. That's where they set up the all-important connection to Rome.
Ah, yes, the deep history justification, the Roman connection.
Right. With archaeology, the story shifted completely, though it was just as political. When they were dealing with the ancient stuff, especially Roman relics, the aim wasn't folklorization at all.
What was it then?
It was about digging up and showing everything Roman they could find, to prove this grand, unbroken continuum of Roman civilization in North Africa.
And because the French saw themselves as the heirs of Rome.
Exactly, showing that Roman continuity basically staked a historical claim on the land. It suggested their own presence wasn't an invasion, but more like a seamless continuation of previous European rule that existed long before Moroccan kingdoms or the arrival of Islam.
It's like historical justification disguised as science.
Precisely. It gave them the ultimate non-local reason for being there with their military. If the Romans were here and we're their successors, then our presence is just restoring the historical order. It's quite a narrative spin.
Okay, so let's look at how this political positioning actually took shape on the ground. To really cement their control and project this image, this benevolent preservation, mixed with historical superiority, the Protectorate took over some incredibly important historic sites.
And turned them into indigenous arts museums. This is where you really see the physical transfer of power happening.
And these weren't just any old buildings, right?
No, not at all. We're talking major symbolic locations. Places like the Batha Palace in Fez, the Udaya's residency in Rabat, Darjamai in Meknes. These were all former centers of royal power, or elite power at least.
That's a really clever move, isn't it?
Yeah.
Take an existing symbol of local authority, spend money restoring it, which looks good, looks like preservation, but then completely change its function to serve your own agenda.
You neutralize the original symbol by turning it into an object of study under your control.
And where did the first objects for these museums come from? Not universities.
No, not initially. The very first collections, the core items, often came directly from French agents, people working in intelligence and the indigenous affairs offices, the municipal services, basically, the operational arms of the Protectorate itself.
Wow.
These officials were already collecting objects, sometimes for political intelligence, sometimes just to decorate their own offices, even before the formal museums were set up.
So collecting was literally part of the administration and military structure from the start.
Absolutely. Let's maybe focus on the Batha Palace in Fez for a minute. The sources really highlight this as a prime example of Marshal Liati's vision.
Liati, the first resident general, the main architect of the whole protectorate system. Why Batha? Why was that the first museum?
The choice was dripping with symbolism. The actual Protectorate Treaty, the document that handed sovereignty to France, was signed right there in the Batha Palace complex on March 30th, 1912.
Okay, so the location itself was historic in that sense.
Extremely. So opening Batha as the first museum was a deliberate act to mark the precise starting point of France's so-called civilizing action in Morocco.
By turning the Sultan's former palace into an exhibition space.
Liaute created a permanent physical monument to that transfer of power. The palace was purposefully stripped of its active role as a tool of the Sultan. The goal was to visually contrast the new French colonial might and modern administration with what they framed as the archaic, inefficient power of the old Moroccan emperors.
The building itself became propaganda.
It did. But it wasn't just the building. It was the specific objects inside, very carefully chosen, that carried the symbolic weight, designed to constantly remind visitors of France's military and political dominance.
This is where it gets really specific, isn't it?
Yeah.
The examples of objects used purely for political messaging in Batha.
Yes, we have 3 really clear examples from the sources. The first one is maybe the most personal symbol of submission, the historic sofa.
The sofa?
Yes, the actual couch where Sultan Moulay Abdelhafid received Liaute on May 25, 1912. It was during a key meeting, the farewell audience for the previous French minister.
And they didn't just put it in a corner with a label, I assume.
No, they fixed a very detailed copper plaque permanently above it.
And what did the plaque say?
It meticulously listed Liaute's whole entourage, entering Fez key figures, his interpreter, even the future head of the historical section. And it hailed the moment as the triumphal entry of the new resident general. One French official at the time explicitly called it the historic sofa.
So it wasn't just furniture. It was a stage prop for a moment of political surrender.
Fossilized and framed as history. It's almost absurd, but deeply symbolic.
Okay, what's the second example?
This relates more to military power. The weapon trophies. They systematically moved traditional weapons from the Sultan's main arsenal, the Dar Makina, straight into the Batha Museum.
What was the message there?
The act itself served to museumify, to basically retire the Sultan's traditional military power, make it a thing of the past, something to be looked at, not used.
But the sources mentioned something darker about where these weapons came from.
Yes, that's the really potent part. A significant number of these weapons came directly from the disarmament of Fez after the huge bloody riots in April 1912, the ones known as the Bloody Days. So displaying these seized weapons was a very direct, undeniable message. We crushed your revolt, we took your arms, we are in charge now. It demonstrated French military pacification and superiority in the starkest terms.
It's basically a trophy case celebrating the suppression of the local population.
Plain and simple. And the third example, maybe the most visceral one, is the display of the cages.
Cages?
Plural. Yes, the 2 cages used for the pretender Rougri, who had rebelled against the Sultan and was finally captured in 1909, before the Protectorate fully began, but during intense French influence.
Why 2 cages?
One was smaller, for transport. The other was larger, used for his public humiliation, displayed to the crowds in the palace square. It symbolized the Maxims, the traditional government's rather brutal justice, and the museum showed both cages.
What was the propaganda goal with displaying those?
It was twofold and very calculated. First, show that France could crush rebels and end the political anarchy they claimed existed before they took over.
Okay. And the second?
To create a stark contrast, show the Maxims' traditional methods, which the French explicitly called barbaric, versus the modern, supposedly enlightened judicial system France was bringing.
Look how brutal things were before us. Look how civilized we are.
Exactly. And this exhibit, the Ruby Cages, it was considered so effective as a symbol that they actually exported it. It was shown in Paris at the Big Colonial Museum in 1934, and it was a major draw at the Casablanca Fair way back in 1915. It was a powerful, reusable symbol of French order versus Moroccan chaos.
So this use of Moroccan arts for propaganda, it clearly wasn't just happening inside Morocco. It was key to how France projected its image internationally, too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Indigenous Moroccan arts were constantly featured in those huge French colonial exhibitions, like the one in Marseille in 1906, and especially the massive Paris colonial exhibition in 1931.
It feels like there were 2 audiences they were playing to.
Definitely. There were the Moroccans back home who were meant to be impressed, maybe intimidated, and then there was the audience in France and internationally who needed constant reassurance that the whole colonial project was worthwhile, culturally valuable, morally right, and importantly, economically sound.
Ah, the economic angle. That seems crucial. And it ties into that Paris Colonial Museum you mentioned. the one Lyautey initiated.
Yes, the one that opened in 31 or 32. It was explicitly conceived, the documents say, as a laboratory of colonial propaganda.
A laboratory.
A machine, essentially, designed to show the world how France was modernizing its colonies, the supposed benefits of the Protectorate. The Moroccan collections there were put in the colonial life section. They used things like dioramas, very immersive displays, and lithographs.
Including images of Rougu's capture, I bet.
Predictably, yes. They really pushed this contrast. Look at the backward, feudal Morocco before 1912 versus the orderly, productive new Morocco flourishing under French guidance.
And this propaganda network reached beyond Paris.
Oh, yes. Colonial institutes were set up in other major French cities, Marseille, Bordeaux, Nancy, and they all housed permanent Moroccan collections too.
All reinforcing the same message.
And just to cement the connection, the North Africa room at the Institute in Nancy was actually named the Salle Lyautey to honor him. This whole network wasn't just for show. It was about education, recruitment for the colonial service, and justifying the whole enterprise to the French public.
Okay, let's pivot slightly to this idea. The French promoted the conservation creation doctrine. This was the argument that museums were fulfilling a duty, right, to save ancient arts.
Yes, the narrative was that these traditional techniques were being lost or distorted because of, Western imports and modern pressures.
So the museum becomes the savior.
Exactly. What's really interesting here is the role the museum takes on. It's not just displaying things. It becomes a laboratory and a refuge for these ancestral techniques.
A laboratory.
But this whole anxiety about losing traditional skills, that was largely an idea imported from the West, stemming from their own experience with the Industrial Revolution. They basically projected that anxiety onto Morocco and claimed they were stepping in to preserve things, supposedly for the Moroccans themselves.
And they even encouraged artisans to use the museums. I think there's a quote from Prosper Ricard.
That's right. Ricard was a key official in the art services. He wrote that artisans were encouraged to visit places like Botha, to review the old collections and all their details, and were asked to take inspiration for their work.
Which sounds quite positive on the surface, saving traditions, helping artisans.
It sounds benevolent, yes, until you follow the money. The real goal wasn't just pure preservation. This renovation of crafts, even when based on old methods, was about giving Moroccan art a very specific, official, state-guaranteed, authentic feel.
Which made it more marketable.
Highly marketable for export. It created lucrative commercial opportunities, especially in Europe and North America.
So the museum wasn't just preserving, it was acting as a kind of quality control and branding office for export goods.
Precisely. The economic role was clear very early on. Remember the 1915 Casablanca Franco-Moroccan exhibition we mentioned?
Yes.
Its success really demonstrated the huge commercial potential of Moroccan arts internationally, and Lyautey himself directly linked this commerce to military strategy. He made that famous, quite chilling statement, "Every open site in Morocco saves a battalion."
Wow, that lays it bare. Commerce is a tool of pacification, cheaper than soldiers.
And the link between museums and commerce was often physical. Some museums, like the one in the Udayas in Rabat, weren't just display spaces. They had active functions.
Like what?
Udayas had a popular Moorish cafe, sure, but it also had a state stamping service right there. Often, there were artisan workshops attached directly to the museum. They were heritage sites, tour spots, and regulated production hubs, all rolled into one.
And this production, especially for valuable items like carpets, was heavily regulated.
Very heavily. Carpet production was controlled by a state stamping process. This was formalized by a dahir, that's a type of royal decree, but issued under French authority on May 20, 1919.
And what did the stamp guarantee?
It guaranteed authenticity of origin, good quality, and indigenous character. This stamp was vital for export, especially to those high-value markets like North America.
So the French state, through its museum-linked services, was literally defining what counted as authentic Moroccan art based on the models they chose to display and promote, and then profiting from it.
That's the core of it. They defined, regulated, and commercialized Moroccanness according to their own standards and interests.
But there's a paradox here, isn't there?
There is. It's the big paradox of this section. While the whole aim was colonial control, profit, and aesthetic regulation, this intense focus on commercialization and standardization did unintentionally lead to something else.
Which was?
It spurred the first really systematic inventory and detailed classification of Morocco's artistic heritage. This early documentation, created for colonial purposes, ironically, still forms a foundational reference for art historians and curators today.
So the Protectorate's control wasn't just about buildings and commerce. It went right to the heart of classifying Moroccan identity itself. How they organized the ethnographic collections in museums seems key here.
Absolutely. On the surface, the classification seems straightforward, based on where things came from geographically, what materials they were made of. Simple enough.
But it wasn't just simple description, was it?
No, that scientific-looking veneer hid a very deliberate socio-political agenda. And this method, it wasn't invented by the museum curators. It was heavily borrowed from those earlier 19th century scientific expeditions.
Expeditions that were often linked to military or intelligence goals. People like Charles de Foucault.
Exactly, or Edmond Dutay. These early researchers, their work often insisted on creating this striking contrast between two supposedly fundamentally different worlds within Morocco. And the museums then staged this division visually.
Okay, so let's break down that division. How did they categorize Moroccan identity through art for museum displays and presumably for political management?
They set up this very rigid dichotomy. On one side, you had what they called citizen Muslim Arab art.
City-based art, what characterized that?
It was defined by sophisticated materials. Gold jewelry, luxurious silks, intricate embroidery, fancy enameled ceramics. And this was deliberately linked to Islamic civilization, particularly its connections to Andalusia. It was framed as the refined, maybe slightly decadent or stagnant culture of the cities. Officials like Ricard just flat out asserted that anything from a city was consequently Arab.
Okay, that's one side. Was the other side the rural Berber art?
Exactly. That was defined by materials seen as more, well, rustic, silver jewelry instead of gold, coarse wool textiles, pottery that wasn't enameled, simpler geometric patterns.
And how is this described?
It was labeled as local, naive, fanciful, and very importantly, it was framed as this sort of primitive, authentic element that was constantly under threat for modern city life, the very thing the French claimed they were protecting the Berbers from.
So the artistic categories immediately became value judgments, and these fed into how the French administered the country.
Directly. This wasn't just art history talk, the sources are clear. This was a premeditated socio-political distinction. It was consciously designed to visually and intellectually separate Berber Moroccans, who often lived under customary law, the Urf from the Arab or citizen Moroccans, who were generally governed by Islamic Sharia law.
It sounds like a textbook divide and rule strategy, using cultural classification as the rationale for political separation.
That's precisely what it looks like. This cultural and artistic separation, visibly presented in museum displays, had its ultimate political expression in that hugely controversial 1930 decree, the Berber Dahir.
Can you remind us, what exactly did the Berber Dahir do?
Essentially, it was a decree aimed at preserving the Berbers' traditional legal autonomy by keeping them under their customary laws and separate from the Sharia courts used by the Arab population.
How is it perceived?
The French framed it as protecting an ancient culture, but the growing Moroccan nationalist movement saw it very differently. They saw it as a deliberate attempt to shatter national unity, to fracture the country along ethnic and legal lines. It became a massive rallying point for resistance because it tried to formalize this division.
So the issue wasn't necessarily acknowledging that Morocco had diverse cultures, which it clearly does. It was the way colonial science twisted those differences.
Exactly. They took the complex reality of Moroccan culture and forced it into these two simplistic, opposing boxes, citizen Arab versus rural Berber. Stereotypes, really, almost caricatures, all to justify separate administrative tracks and maintain control.
A political goal masked as ethnography.
And what's quite sobering, our sources suggest, is that this strict Arab-Berber dichotomy born out of colonial ideology was so powerful that it didn't just disappear with the Protectorate. It has lingered, and in some museum contexts, even today, it can still influence how Moroccan art is categorized and shown.
Okay, let's circle back to those antiquities museums. We know the goal was proving this Roman connection, this continuum, but how they actually did the archaeology sounds less like scholarship and more like, well, a military operation.
That's a very accurate way to put it. The establishment of the official archaeology service under the French happened at exactly the same time as the military pacification campaigns were rolling out across the country. Not according to the sources. The stated goal, coming from the very top of the administration, was crystal clear: find physical proof of a long-term European presence before the French arrived, provide that deep historical justification for the current occupation.
And the star location for this was Volubilis, the big Roman city ruins.
Volubilis was absolutely central to Leoti's whole strategy. He didn't just leave it as a ruin for scholars, he actually turned Volubilis into a military post between 1915 and 1918.
A military post.
Yes, and formally attached it to the military command in nearby Meknes. This ensured that any archaeological work done there would definitely follow the right path, meaning the path that supported the colonial narrative of European historical precedents.
So Leoti wasn't just interested in Rome academically.
Not primarily. He saw Roman civilization specifically as the direct ancestor of European civilization. This narrative allowed French troops and the administration to see themselves not as invaders, but as the legitimate heirs of those Roman soldiers who had supposedly brought peace and civilization centuries earlier.
And they highlighted specific monuments to make this point.
Yes, this historical claim wasn't subtle at all. Leoti personally pushed for the restoration of the most impressive, most prestigious Roman monuments. The big focus was on symbols of power and order, especially the Arch of Caracalla. That restoration was a major project, finished in 1934.
Why that arch in particular? What was the symbolism for the French?
It was incredibly potent. Historically, the arch was built by the locals back in Roman times to thank Emperor Caracalla for his protection. Leoti and his administration shrewdly jumped on this story. They used this ancient account of the Volubilitans showing loyalty and gratitude to their Roman occupiers to mirror the exact relationship they wanted the Moroccan people to have with the French during the ongoing pacification campaigns. See, loyalty to European power is historically correct here.
So projecting the Roman dynamic onto the current situation.
Exactly. And just to hammer the point home, the sources mention they even reissued an old postcard. It depicted the ancient Volubilitans submitting to the Roman army commander. The message was explicit, linking the two periods of European occupation as one long, venerable succession.
This idea of a venerable succession was actively promoted then.
Oh, absolutely. People like Louis Chaudelin, who was head of the Antiquities Service, were very vocal about it. He argued quite openly that these Roman ruins served a purpose to teach the natives that a great people from whom we descend, meaning Europeans had conquered, brought peace and justice, and civilized Morocco for centuries before the Arabs even arrived.
That's just blatant historical revisionism for political gain.
Weaponized archaeology, essentially. And the methods they used to dig this stuff up were just as militaristic. Even before 1915, before formal excavations started, the French military mapping teams, the topographic brigades, were ordered to actively look for and collect Roman fragments while they were out surveying. It was part of their job. And then comes a truly bizarre detail involving World War I.
What happened?
Leoti, right in the middle of the Great War, saw an opportunity. He decided to use the conflict not just as cover, but tactically. He actually requested German prisoners of war be sent to Morocco.
German POWs to do archaeology.
Yes. Apparently he wanted to humiliate Germany. A huge number, around 5,500 German POWs arrived starting in 1915, and they were put to work doing the heavy digging at key sites like Volubilis and also at the Hassan Mosque site in Rabat.
That is an incredible image. German prisoners digging up Roman ruins to justify a French colony during a war between France and Germany.
It's a remarkable historical footnote, isn't it? It solved several problems for Leoti replaced French and local labor needed for the army, and it forced German enemies to work under French military command on a French prestige project.
Did Leoti show personal interest?
Definitely. He underscored how politically important this all was by personally attending the official launch of the Volubilis excavations on May 25th, 1915, making a statement.
And the finds were immediately used for propaganda.
Straight away. The very first significant Roman artifacts they dug up were quickly cleaned up and rushed off to be displayed at the 1915 Casablanca Fair. That fair was the first really big PR event designed to sell the success story of the new protectorate to Morocco and the world.
What really strikes me here, listening to this, is the contrast. This huge focus on Roman sites. What about sites related to Morocco's own history? Islamic dynasties.
That's a key contrast, the sources point out. While you had this massive, well-funded, militarized, official program for anything Roman, there was a conspicuous lack of official interest or any systematic state funding for excavating or preserving sites related to Moroccan dynasties or Islamic history.
So those were just ignored.
largely left to private individuals, personal initiatives. The official state machine only really geared up after 1920 for some Islamic sites, and even then, the focus remained heavily skewed. The priority was clear. Excavate the history that justifies our presence, not the history of the people we are currently ruling.
Okay, let's try to pull all these threads together. What we've uncovered seems clear. The museums and heritage institutions set up in Morocco under the French weren't just quiet places of study, not at all.
No, they were incredibly complex, multi-layered tools. They functioned simultaneously as, well, propaganda machines.
As economic engines, driving that state-controlled craft production.
And as vehicles for justifying the occupation itself, using that very specific manipulated version of history, especially the whole Roman continuum argument.
If we step back and look at the bigger picture from all this detail, there's that strange paradox again, isn't there?
There really is. Despite the clearly political, often militaristic, and definitely commercial motivations behind setting all this up, this whole systematic process, it did end up creating the first truly comprehensive inventory and detailed classification of Morocco's archaeological and artistic heritage on a large scale.
Documentation created by the colonizer for colonial purposes.
Exactly. Created through colonial means, yes, but it established a baseline of data. And that data, ironically, remains a critical reference point for scholars and, importantly, for the Moroccan nation itself today as it studies its own past.
That's the tangled legacy of colonialism, isn't it? Imposing foreign narratives, undermining local power, but sometimes, almost accidentally, creating tools or records that can later be used by the formerly colonized people to reclaim their own story.
Which brings us to a final thought, maybe something for you, the listener, to reflect on after hearing all this.
Okay.
If that original museum discourse, the whole story told by these institutions, was so exclusively shaped by French colonial officials designed to create a specific political and commercial identity for Morocco, the citadin versus the Berber, the Roman link, French superiority, then what essential truths about Moroccan heritage itself, the local stories, the internal complexities, the non-stereotypical narratives, the history of pre-colonial power, what was left completely outside that French-controlled frame, and perhaps more importantly, how does Morocco today work to, decolonize those very same collections, those very same buildings, and reclaim the narrative?
That's a profound challenge indeed. A lot to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the archaeology and art of colonial power. We'll see you next time.